Now let's move to the recommended state. There are other recommended states, but the recommended state the states I want to recommend to you are South Australia and Western Australia. One of the reasons has to do with the skill assessment process for most of the occupation I just mentioned. So I'll go back to the previous page. So I have listed the skill assessment authority here as VET-Assess. I'm not sure whether you have come across this skill assessing authority quite often, but for most of the occupations here on the list, so the marketing, the finance, the human resource, and the statistician, their assessing authority are VET-Assess. So in order to get a positive skill assessment from VET-Assess, unlike accounting or accountant, you only need to study and get an English test, you can get positive skill assessment. For VET-Assess, you need a highly relevant qualification, which means a major in one of those fields, plus 1 year highly relevant part-time work experience, so 20 hours a week. So for a marketing or finance or human resource graduate, the earliest time you can get a skill assessment or you can start looking for a visa to apply would be a year after you graduate. That will be the quickest time, assuming that you get into a job straight after you graduate. So by the time you complete your 1 year working experience, you can apply for a skill assessment. The skill assessment turnaround time can be less than 2 weeks if you get the priority processing request. So 2 weeks after your 1 year work experience, you will get positive skill assessment. Then you can look into your state nomination. So that's why we recommend the South Australia as a top priority, because in South Australia, if you want to get a South Australia nominate the 190 visa, now you have to have a 1 year highly relevant work experience as a either part-time or full-time. So the requirement for South Australia to nominate you is exactly same as your skill assessment, which means while you are doing your work experience to meet the skill assessment requirement, at the same time you are meeting the South Australia state nomination requirement. So that's why we recommend South Australia as our the top of the list. The other reason I put South Australia on the top of the list is that so South Australia nominates about 500 occupations, which is pretty much everything that's on the Department of Home Affairs occupation list. So as long as what you studied or what the occupation you try to achieve is on the Department of Home Affairs occupation list, you will be able to get a nomination from South Australia. The third reason I would recommend South Australia is that, for South Australia, if your occupation is not highly in demand in the state, that means you have to meet additional requirements to get a nomination. So the additional requirements are either you are South Australia graduates, so you studied in South Australia and completed your work experience, etc. Or if you have completed a 12 months work experience in South Australia. What does that mean? That means if you studied in Sydney, Melbourne, or any other big cities, you are running out of your options for visa for permanent resident, you can actually move to South Australia, work a year part-time in highly relevant fields, and then get a state nomination from South Australia. However, for those coming from interstate, you will only get a 491 rather than 190. But again, like I said, you need the work experience for the skill assessment anyway. So if you do the work experience in South Australia, while you are completing the work experience for skill assessment, at the same time, you are completing the state nomination requirement for South Australia. So the second state I would recommend is Western Australia. So similar to South Australia, Western Australia requires work experience as well, and that's one of the reasons I would recommend Western Australia. However, please bear in mind Western Australia has a shorter occupation list. And if you want to be nominated an occupation from their state nomination list, you pretty much need to be their graduate. That means it's only suitable for if you studied in Western Australia. If you're coming from interstate, then that's not the best place for you to go and get a state nomination. So maybe the other state that I didn't put here, which you might get a state nomination, is New South Wales. So New South Wales nominates a lot of business-related occupation as well. However, New South Wales, the way how New South Wales nomination works is like similar to 189. So you have to express your interest first, and you wait for them to pick you, to select you to apply for the New South Wales nomination. So there are some uncertainty around it. That's why I didn't put New South Wales here. And for the rest of Australia, they are not as friendly to the business students as South Australia and Western Australia. That's why I didn't put them there as well.